recording. Okay, over to yourself, Tara, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for asking me. And I don't want to be like too modest. I wouldn't say I was a guru, but I have been supporting primary care networks since kind of the start of their inception. So I've got a presentation. I know a lot of you will have your cameras off, but if you have any questions throughout, don't wait till the end, or if you disagree with anything or you want further clarification, please just put your hand up. So let me just share my screen. So hopefully I can't see you, so I might just come off mute if you've got any questions. So I thought it'd be helpful to share some of my reflections of supporting over 200 primary care networks and sharing some practical advice. So we're going to cover the importance of what I think is appreciating the context that we work within. It can be a very challenging environment. I am an interim PCN manager myself, so I don't just stand here as a consultant. I am in it, and I'm currently supporting Maidenhead Primary Care Networks. It is a network of 9 practices, 82,000 patients, and what we call a non-DES practice. So we've got one practice in the network that doesn't really want anything to do with the network, but we still provide services to them. I want to talk about managing conflict and kind of building relationships. Got some examples of how others are making it work, and I will try my best to share practical examples as we go along. So just a little bit about me. I am a mum. I've got 3 children. At the front, you'll see my youngest, who's got a blue hoodie on. She's got type 1 diabetes. Layla, just to the back with her hair in a ponytail, she's got a kidney condition called nephrotic syndrome. And that is where when she relapses, the walls of her kidneys are scarred and she retains fluid and kind of blows up a bit like an Oompa Loompa. And we're under specialist care under the Evelina Children's Hospital. I'm based in Kent in Whitstable. And then my daughter with the braids in her hair, she turns 17 next month. And that's my husband, Mark. We've been together for 25 years. So I'm an NHS manager, I run a business, but healthcare is a huge, huge part of my life. I love a physical challenge. I always say to people, if you meet me in person, I don't look very fit, but I can run. And my sweet spot is I like a 50K or 100K. I like long distance. I've worked at McDonald's. I've been a barrister's clerk, and I've worked in the insurance market, and I've worked in university. And I like to share my professional background because often when primary care networks, maybe not so much now, but in the past, are looking for somebody with general practice experience, which I 100% understand, and it is really important, but you can be trained. I will say I wasn't brought up in the NHS, but I moved over and I brought my leadership and management skills over to into primary care networks. I'm really lucky. I've been involved in some quite big projects. So at the university, I was a project manager on a stem cell laboratory. I've been previously part of the NHS England Time for Care faculty. I've got an MBA in leadership and management in healthcare. And I initially started kind of my NHS career when they're called training hubs now, but at the very beginning, they were called Community Education Provider Network, CEPNs, and I helped establish 12 of those across the country. It's just a little bit more about me before I go in. So we provide project management, interim management, consultancy to training hubs, GP federations. We also provide interim management to primary care networks and consultancy, and we've also created some online courses. And one of the things that we're really, really proud of is as much as we can, we try to share kind of best practice, lessons learned, and just answer as many questions as we can in our blog. So yeah, we've got over 250 blogs. We try to the frequently asked questions we get, we'll just turn them into a blog and we will share them. And then also, some of you will know, well, a lot of you will probably know Hussein Gandhi and Andy Foster. We've been working together, I think, for the last 4 years, and for the last 3 years, we have created a conference together with Ben Gowland called PCN Plus. That's coming up on the 23rd of April. We also have a members club, which is a paid for community for networks looking for even more tools and techniques and advice and support. Sorry. And then I have a podcast called The Business of Healthcare, and we have released over 300 episodes. So I am I'm an oversharer. If I see something working well or there are lessons to be learned, I like to provide the platform to share that. So if we start in the presentation, so one of the things that I learned on my MBA was really the importance of understanding the context that we work within. So one of the analogies I like to use is that a primary care network is a little bit like a startup. NHS England gave networks or gave groups of practices that may not have had any history of working together quite a large sum of money. Like no due diligence was taken place, and they kind of said, you need to do a few things, off you go. That is, for some people, it has been absolutely incredible. For some, it's been really challenging, and it's understanding why it is challenging. And I said before in preparation, I really don't want this to come over as negative, but I think it is important to be honest about the reality. So there's lots of, in the networks that we have supported, lots of different levels of engagement. Typically, there will always be, depending on the size, but there'll always be 1 or 2 practices that just don't engage for a variety of reasons, and some practices and some particular people that take the lead. There's different levels of understanding, even today, we're so many years down the line, but people are like, why are we here? What are we doing? What's the purpose of this primary care network? There's different needs and wants. You've got different size practices that need and want different things. There's different motivations. There's a lot of personalities. In some instances, there's a deep history between practices, deep conflict. As a PCN manager, I've learned this kind of the hard way, but at the beginning, it was like everything is about the primary care network. And the more I learned and the more I got involved, it's like, this is not, this is not everybody's number one priority at all. Obviously, we had the pandemic to contend with. There's a lack of time. It is really, really, really busy. So not everyone has got the time or wants to dedicate the time to this. We've got individual businesses coming together. There is a hierarchy in practices where the GP and the clinical staff are at the top, and kind of, if you're non-clinical, you, depending where you are, you're down towards the bottom of the hierarchy. There's lots of politics internally and externally, as we see and feel. Sometimes it feels like everything is new or everything has been done before, depending on how long we've been working in general practice. Demand is high and it's really increasing. There's a lot of uncertainty. Obviously, we've seen the news about NHS England last week. So you're thinking, God, like, what's in store? Depending again on how your network is set up, there might be no clear direction, or in some networks, they feel like micromanaged by the leadership and management team of the network. A limited understanding of PCN management roles or PCN roles in general. Limited understanding of what a life is like in practice if you're, like you're a new role to your primary care network and you've not been in practice. I've put multiple businesses coming together who ideally wouldn't want to. You probably wouldn't choose the partners, for some of you, that you're working with. There's a lot of bad press, and obviously we're waiting for the GP contract. So that, it's not surprising why some of us are struggling in this environment, because the context is very, very challenging. So we had the letter about the GP contract. I won't go through it. I think lots of you would have seen it. From a primary care network perspective, what I get from it is more flexibility, less of an ask, more flexibility. Now, depending on the sort of network you're in, that could be very challenging, because where's the accountability? And I think I saw a video the other day where someone said, just divvy up the money and just put that into practices. So it really depends. There are networks. If you've got a strong relationship, you'll think, great, we've got more independence to do what we want to do for the best of our patients. If you are struggling in your network, everyone's fighting for control, and you kind of want to, like be married but separated and do your own thing. So it really depends on the maturity and the relationships inside of your network. I won't go through this too much, but there are some things that networks are supposed to do. A lot of this stuff should be business as usual, and that some of the people I'd say do the minimum. And in some networks, they're not really fussed about this. So like we do that, Tara. We're focused on doing other sorts of things. And a good example is in Maidenhead, we're currently bidding for a dermatology service. We're going for, they're a limited company. We're going for EMIS PCN, and we're looking at how we can kind of redesign our enhanced access to make it more efficient, more profitable, and be more independent. So it really depends on where you are and what you want to do. So I stand here as a pragmatist. It is really challenging, and I'll talk about some of the most common challenges which come up is around equity. So the notion of fair shares, and it's very hard to like cut the cake in perfect equal sizes so everybody gets their bit. So that can be really challenging. A lack of trust in the network, and that's really hard to build, and we'll come on to that a little bit more. Staffing and premises, and we've got this workforce. How can we develop them? How can we retain them? And where do we keep them? Like, where are they going to work? So that can be really, really challenging. There's lots of variation in ICB support, and how this kind of a recent example of this is around the GPRs. In some areas, the ICB were really hands off and just kind of let them get on with it. In others, they're really hands on and kind of like, who's Tara and how are you paying for her? So it really depends. There's conflict, succession planning. There is, I think, a wave of clinical directors that want to step down but feel that they can't because who's gonna step in. And relationships. So lots and lots and lots of different terms and conditions, and that can be very challenging from a HR perspective. So if we talk about relationships and conflict, I wrote a paper a while ago called Herding Tigers, and I will say to people, have you ever heard of the phrase herding cats? People say, oh, general practice is like herding cats. And I think, oh, herding cats would be easy. I think general practice is like herding tigers. It can be a very tough environment. And as somebody, like, I see myself as a bit of an outsider, I always think like even the smallest of practices, if you want to move them and they don't want to be moved, wash your back. It can be very stressful environment. So one of the things I've learned, which might be helpful for you, and you would have, I'm sure if you've done anything like Myers-Briggs or core strengths, we're all really different, and we're very different at work to how we are at home. And some of us are really motivated by the welfare of others and kind of people management, and want to know, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for the team? Have we communicated it? Are we being fair? Is everybody okay? So their first thought will be about people and the team. Some of us are really process orientated. Actually, if I go back, for those of us that are very people orientated, the analogy we use is they're like the ambulance, they're the caregivers, they're the people that just want to make sure everybody is okay. Some of us are really process orientated, and the analogy we use is that they're like a submarine. They're independent thinkers, they're deep in thought. They're the sort of people that you might be in a meeting and they might not say anything, but after the meeting, after they've had some time to think about it, they will want to know, are the I's dotted and the T's crossed? None of this is bad, by the way, and we're all a mixture of everything. Some of us are heavily performance motivated. So the analogy we use is they're like the snowplow, they're like the leaders. They've thought about the money, they're thinking of what's in this for me, what's in this for the network, what are the key performance indicators. Okay, we're either going to go forward or we're not, it's not worth it. And then on top of that, some of us are very heavily motivated by the past. So they will always be drawing on what has been. And that's not, again, it's fine. Some of us are very motivated by the present and thinking, I just want to, like I just want to get home. I just want to get home at the end of each day and have a good time with my family. And some of us are very future orientated and thinking, they're not concerned by the past and the present. They're all eyes on the future. And you have so much more. We've all seen the kind of the iceberg. What you see of me today is just the tip of the iceberg. So that's why it's really hard. And I think the key to navigating your primary care network or any sort of project where there's multiple organisations is to try to understand people's different perspectives and where they are coming from, especially if they think very differently from you. It really, really is important. And not to just think, oh, they're just being awkward. They don't think the way that I think, therefore they are wrong. There is, there's multiple sides of the same story. There's multiple truths, and everybody is right in some way, shape, or form most of the time. Another thing that I found quite helpful, and there is quite a popular management consultant called Patrick Lencioni, and he talks about the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And you can have a team that has an absence of trust, has fear of conflict, has a lack of commitment, has avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. And I know lots of primary care networks that have all of these recipes. And it's trying to think about if you can reflect on your network, if you had to just choose one, what dysfunction do you think comes out loud and clear? And trust is at the bottom, because if you don't have trust, it's really, really hard to be in a relationship, any sort of relationship. If you don't trust your partner, if you don't trust your recipients, is how do you build that trust? And it goes back to the fundamentals. I know lots of networks that don't meet. So you can't expect to have a good relationship if you never ever meet, if you never kind of get beyond the surface, if you're frightened of conflict, or there may have been outright conflict and you can't communicate, it's very hard. So again, I think sometimes having facilitation or having some sort of mediation, you're trying to work out, where does this lack of trust come from, and how do you move on? There's a lack of commitment, and this goes back to the different levels of engagement in the network, and really having a question around, what does commitment look like in our primary care network? What do we want people to do? Like, what behaviours do we want them to display? Sometimes if a network is quiet and will kind of go along, it doesn't mean they've got necessarily a lack of commitment, but it's about being really explicit around, how do we want our network to operate? Avoidance of accountability is a really big one, and this comes around like transparency sometimes. And I think sometimes people aren't fully transparent, not because it's bad, but they're worried if there's something gone wrong or something's not quite right, they're frightened that they will be blamed and ousted. So that avoidance of accountability, and then the inattention to results. I think this was really rife when the investment fund indicators there was a lot of them, and people wanted to know how the network was performing, and that information wasn't always there. I think it's settled down a little bit, but at the end of the year, or not even at the end of the year, there'll always be someone that kind of says, what does the network do? And there isn't any kind of performance. It doesn't mean it has to be heavily micromanaged, but you want to be able to say, this is what we have achieved, this is what we've done, this is how much money we've put back into practice. So you want to look at your results and share them and be transparent about the successes and the failures. I can't see, so let me know if there's any questions, okay? So some of you may have heard of forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Now, imagine depending on how many practices you've got in your network, there will be lots of organisations going along this cycle. So again, you can understand why it's challenging. If there are 9 practices, each of those practices independently will be going through forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning in their organisation. Put all of those organisations together, you can understand why there is a lot of storming. But I don't want to be negative. There's also a lot of performing. And this goes back to, if you think about how your individual practices operate, there will be some sort of vision, some sort of purpose. You will have a regular partners meeting. You may have socialized a little bit outside of work. You see each other on a regular basis. So you can manage that storming and you can go into norming. And you've got those relationships. And the notion of this is that in any group dynamics, when you first come together, it's all fine and it's all good. And, you know, it's exciting. There's this new project or there's this new organization. Then you go into storming. This is when you start to think, I didn't really sign up for this. Or, you know, I wanted to be the lead, but that person thinks they're the lead. Or I'm not quite sure about this. And you start to think, I'm not, you know, this doesn't feel as good as I thought it was going to be. Hopefully you can work through those differences and you settle into norming, and you've got clear roles and responsibilities, you've got processes, you've got SOPs, and you start to find your rhythm. Then you start to go through performing, or you might go to norming, you might go back to storming. But in performing, I say to people, that's when you're getting GP Practice of the Year, or you're nominating yourselves for HSJ awards, and you can really pinpoint some successes, and you know each other and you know how to communicate. And then adjourning, somebody will leave or something will change. You get a new contract and then you go through the cycle all again. So everybody is going through their different stages of development. Bring that together in a primary care network. It can be very, very challenging. So I just wanted to give some examples of conflict, which I am accustomed to. So an example is, we're not getting our fair shares of the staff allocation. Okay. So what would my advice be? So I'm in it, this happens all the time, to review the formal allocation criteria for the additional role reimbursement scheme. Okay. So we will go back and have a look at how many hours are they getting, and why did we decide this? What's it based on? It's usually based on their list size, and look back and say, well, no, actually you may feel like you're not getting your fair shares, but actually you are. And if you're not, we need to work out why is that. Also, we look at what the network, sorry, there's a little typo there, what the network delivers in its totality. So you may be getting less of one role, but you may be getting another and more of something else. So to look at the network in its totality, take into consideration the past, but to focus on the future. So the example I can give is that there is the practice that doesn't have any pharmacists, and it comes up every single time. Before my time, there's no pharmacists, there's no pharmacists, there's no pharmacists. But when we look back, that practices over the years had 5 pharmacists for whatever reason did not work in their practice. So the network made the decision that we tried, but for whatever reason, everybody we've put in the practice has not worked out. You've not liked them. So we've said, actually, you're not going to have that role anymore. You know, like that was a fact. And now that practice is kind of, they manage without a pharmacist. But we had a conversation, said, are we going to penalise them forever? You know, can we start to, what additional role could go in there? And then we were having a conversation, and we're going to try again. But there was a little bit, we had to kind of look back to see why had that not happened, and can we move forwards? And then there is something about taking into consideration the complexity of the network. And if you move one thing, it has an unintended kind of negative consequence in another area. So it's not just a straight, oh, okay, I need to take that person, put them there. So there is an element of compromise, but I would definitely, speak to, if practice isn't happy, or if there is an issue, we do need to look at it and also think, is this just one practice's issue, or is it, is it multiple practices that are affected by the decision that we've made? So my advice is, we need to have a look at it. And for whatever the reason, and whatever the outcome is, we need to kind of work through it very, logically and methodically, and then think about what are the options available. And I think when you think about what's the word, like mediation, like if we go through this investigation, we go through the process, the final outcome is the final outcome. And there may be that somebody still doesn't like it. But as long as we're fair and we've communicated, that would be my approach. It's not easy, but I definitely think there's usually a resolution that can happen if both parties are willing to compromise. Another issue that we come up is we're struggling to accommodate certain staff in our network. Can you just give me the money instead? So that comes up quite often. And here I'd say, let's go back to the network's vision and the principles for collaboration. So in some networks, they do devolve income down to, you might devolve all of your hours budget and just say, do what you like. And if that's the vision and principles, then that seems logical. If that is logical for you, based on what you've said that you're going to do. If that's not the principle beyond your network, it's unlikely that the leadership and management team are going to go, do you know what, if you one practice you're not happy, we're just going to give you the money. So you do need to go back to the vision and principles and remind practices, this is what we collectively said we were going to do. But if things have changed, that's okay. Just because you've said one thing in 2019, it doesn't mean nothing can change. We're now, it's 2025 and things are different. It's okay if things have changed. Again, I'd want to know, is this a network-wide issue or is it confined to one practice? And then what are the options? So I've got another practice where they really struggled with a physician's associate. And we got together, especially when there was lots of press and we shouldn't use them. We got together and said, what is going to be this network stance on physicians associates? And they said, we want to keep the role, because some practices they really embrace them. They put a lot of training and effort into them, and they were delivering value to the practice. But in some practices, they just couldn't get the value. So then we looked at, okay, we can kind of redistribute this physician's associate, and actually, could you have an extra pharmacist? So it wasn't just like everybody has to have it. There was compromise. There were some options. Some practices really can utilize a pharmacist and love them, and other practices can really utilize a pharmacist. The compromise is it's not the same. The salaries are different. And if you get a role that's kind of less than a PA, you don't get that additional cash. So that's a compromise. These are the roles, these are the salaries. What would you like to do? You can either have one or the other, or nothing. So again, you have to work out what is best for your network. But I don't think it's one size fits all. I don't think everybody has to have the same. If you are a really large training practice and you've got, a large list size and you've got lots of people in your network, and compared to a practice that's got 2 GPs and you're not a training practice and you don't have the capacity to provide the level of supervision, then that practice can have something different. So another thing it might be helpful is around engagement. And I always say, when you're communicating things, and some of you will be experiencing this right now, some of you will not be interested in anything I've got to say, so your engagement will be low. Some people will be uncertain. If you want somebody to do something, they might be uncertain about what is required, and if they're really busy, their engagement might be low. Some people are scared of the unknown, so they'll opt out. Some of you will be really distracted, so your engagement might be low. There might be no sense of urgency, so that will affect your level of engagement. There will be a perceived importance. To some people, it might be really important. To other practices, the information being shared is no importance whatsoever. There might be a lack of incentives. So if we think about the different types of people and the performance orientated people, they'll be thinking, there's no money in this for me. I can't see any patient benefit. There's no incentive for me to want to engage with this. For some people, there'll be not enough information. For some people, there'll be too much information. For some people, there'll be emotional attachments. If you've had a project that you've been working on for a really long time, you don't want to let that go. There's that sunk cost. You'll think, I put so much effort into this, I can't give up now. For some people, there's just no emotional attachment and just don't care. Some of us will be, scared of failure. So think, actually, let's not do that. For some people, it's too complex. For some of us, some practices will be like, there's no sustainability to this. So what's the point in jumping through all of these hoops when the money runs out in 3 months? Sometimes it's not thought out. So you've not thought the what, like who, what is it, why, when, what's going to happen? Does this match the culture? Sustainability, is the timing right? Another thing will be around equity. So if it feels like this doesn't feel like, I'm I'm not going to get my share of equity here, I'm not interested. Might be a lack of understanding or appreciation about the context. And what I mean by this is that sometimes your PCN managers or whoever's leading your clinical directors or whatever your structure of the roles look like, they may be privy to information that not everybody has. So they're trying to sell something based on the information that they have, but they may not be able to share the why. So there is kind of, there is a lack of communication, a lack of understanding or appreciation about why it's important to do some of these activities. And there may be political and historical tension. So it is, for managers on the call and clinical directors, you're really thinking carefully, like, do I send this in an email or do I put it in an infographic? Do I share should I share it now, but I don't have all of the information? So if I share it, like this is on the horizon, but I don't have any of the details, people won't be interested. So you have to be strategic when it comes to communication. And really quickly, one of the exercises we do is when we're focusing on where to focus is to create your own criteria. So when I worked in Warrington, we had some funding that we wanted to kind of distribute and had to think really carefully about the proposition. Is it a shared problem? Can we use PCN finances to solve it? Does it support QOF? That was really important. Does it release capacity in general practice? Can any income be reinvested into general practice? And does it support a local or national commissioning priority? So what I would say, you can develop your own criteria. It could be anything that you like, but when you feel really struggling with engagement, really reflect on how does your practice make decisions? How do you present that information? And does it tick the boxes that your practices are going to be looking for? And then just thought it'd be helpful to share some examples of how others are making it work. So in one of the networks we've supported, they had a PCN level call and recall for childhood vaccinations to improve their vaccination rates, support QOF targets and general practice income. They utilised their PCN care coordinators, and that was led by a PCN, like their lead PCN practice manager. And that was it was a network that hadn't worked very collaboratively before. It was quite low, like low risk. It was a practice manager's idea. And the challenge was that all of the practices had slightly different processes, but because it was led by a practice manager, so having a key person of influence, we managed to align the processes, and that has worked really, really well. In another PCN, they set up PCN group clinical supervision and peer support. So in each of the practices, obviously the duty doctor provides day-to-day clinical supervision, but then we set up lunch and learns led by a senior PCN pharmacist and clinical education facilitators funded by the local training hub. So that worked really well for the practices that didn't have that kind of clinical supervision element. This is quite a big one in a network. So in Dover, Primary Care Network is a network of 3 practices. They pulled together their COVID vaccination profits and core funding to fund premises to support their R staff. Now, there was so much debate about this, and they were reluctant to do it because they were like, well, then the ICB will never fund it. If we fund it, we'll never get it reimbursed. But they decided that's what they needed to do. They did not want their staff to work from home, and there was an opportunity to utilise a building. In another network led by care coordinators, an advanced nurse and a pharmacist to support frail patients. So that was what they called their primary care at home. And there was also a named GP. So this was not about the care home days. This was an additional element for their frail patients living at home. In another network, and this I think is quite common, to have group level consultations. And in Cranbrook PCN, we set up type 2 diabetes clinics for their Indian and Asian communities. And I'd say the Mecca, one network collaboratively bought a local pharmacy. So it can work. It's not all negative. It absolutely can work. So my question to you to think about is, it's easy to focus on the negatives, but there will be areas that have worked well. And there's an opportunity to understand the principles behind your success and to build on these. So versus focusing on what's not going well, can you point to an initiative that has worked well and really think, why did it work well? Who led it? How was it funded? How was it communicated? What roles were involved? What was the benefit? How long did it take? How was it initially introduced? And I'd say when you work out like your recipe for success, then replicate it and do it again and do it again and do it again. I think it's people don't look back and think, why did things work? We only focus on why didn't it work? And one of the things we like to do is to create a really simple, like, I was like, I've got an MBA. And at the beginning, I was like, here's my really complex, like, here's my fancy business plan. And actually, what really worked well was just a plan on a page. So in Warrington, we said we all got together, we did a SWOT analysis, and we also thought, like, what do we want to do? What makes sense for us to do individually, and what makes sense for us to do collective as a network? And we just created a plan on a page. And then in every PCN meeting, we brought this up to remind the network, this is what we said that we were going to do. And just to speak to, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. One of the things the network did decide to do was each practice to have a care coordinator, regardless of the size. So every practice got one FTE care coordinator. So, you know, the larger practice perceived that they missed out, but there was that compromise. So sometimes if you really strip it back and say, what do we want to do? They wanted maximum achievement of the impact investment fund, and that would be divvied up and sent back to, that money would be divvied up and paid back to practices. They wanted to invest in their workforce, and that resulted in them hiring a senior pharmacist where they use their PCN a fraction of their PCN participation fund to top up the salary of a senior pharmacist to provide clinical supervision to that team. Okay, so that money typically goes to practices in Warrington. That money went back into the network. They wanted improved digital infrastructure and were happy to invest in Apex, Arden's digital triage and better letter. They had funding for health kiosks, so everybody got a health kiosk. They created a personalised care team. They decided to merge their FCP service with pain clinic. Talked about care coordination, and they wanted a centralised pharmacy hub. And the network also said they were going to invest in their leadership and management team and send somebody on an apprenticeship. So that's what they wanted to do, and they've been really successful at that. So the future, I don't work for NHS England. I probably don't know anything that you guys don't know. I think change in one form or another is certain, and you guys are really good at responding to that change. I do think there'll be more integration, and obviously we've got the news about integrated neighbourhood teams. Some people already use that term. For some of us, it's really developing. In Maidenhead, we're thinking about what does an integrated neighbourhood team look like around children and mental health services. There's more digital innovation. And again, as an example, we're putting on an AI showcase to help practices understand what options are out there. We do need to really think carefully about our workforce, regardless of what happens with PCNs. We've got these people and we're going to lose them if we don't develop them. And there will be more work required of practices and networks. And I think there'll be more opportunities for those that have the vision that can move quickly. I really do believe that. I think there will be that maturity. There'll be the networks that, hate being a network, will be left fighting at the back. And then at the front, there'll be the innovators thinking, what can we do with this opportunity? So I'm going to stop there. I hope that answers some of the questions around, like the conflict, or it speaks to some of the conflict that's happening in practices. I know, Stuart, you had a question, I'll stop sharing, around employment. And that can be really challenging. So if anyone's, I'm not a HR expert, so I would say that, but as a PCN manager in Maidenhead, there's 45 members of staff. We've done lots of occupational health assessments around, and then what do we do? The recommendations of that that occupational health report, and maternity GPs and things like that. So if anyone's got any particular questions, I can have a bash at just sharing my approach to them.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Tara. So I've I've got a few questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
I always do this, sorry. You mentioned earlier about PCN disputes, and you talk about the pharmacist, for which was then at what point within that decision-making process did did the PCN say, right, there needs to be a timeline on this. We need to now become a bit more inclusive. In terms of the practice that didn't really have that pharmacist support going forward, what was the timeline for that? And was there any kind of recompense for obviously for that practice, because they're missing out on a specialist in all of this, really? So I can imagine the patients are probably going to be impacted by the decision that's made by the remaining practices within the PCN.
So in that particular instance, so that decision had been made, and then I had joined the PCN as the interim manager, and it kept coming up. So I spoke with the clinical director and said, look, are we, like essentially we're going to penalise this practice forever? Are they never ever going to get a pharmacist? Because I think that things move on and things change. So we did have a look at it, and they did say, do you know what, they initially said, we've survived without a like, screw you, we don't want a pharmacist now. And I said, well, look, should we try again? And what do you want? Like, you choose this is how many hours you are entitled to. You interview the person. This is the training. This is what we can support. Are you ready, willing to give this another go? And the network did have budget, so the network was kind of underspent. So it was kind of, rather than look back and go, oh, we owe you all of this, it was like, okay, this has been the decision, we're going to reverse it, and you're going to have that moving forwards. And they're out for recruitment at the moment. So I wouldn't say it was me, but sometimes having an external person, and you could do it with another clinical director. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes having an external view come in and go, look, I know that this is what happened, but it's not answering your question. In another network, in another practice, it was a similar issue where they couldn't get on with a social prescriber. So we had a meeting, said, look, this is all the other networks get on well. There is something about the culture of this practice where this role is not working. Do you want the role? Are we giving you something you don't want? They said, we do want the role. We do value the role. So we said, okay, we're going to do what we're going to, you get one more chance, because we can't keep recycling through these roles. And if, again, after you've chose them, you've trained them, if you're not happy with them, then you won't get that role again. And we wrote that down like in an agreement. So if you don't make it work, you're not having another one. So it's quite hard, quite tough. So I think we have to be direct, but I do think, I'm an employer. Not everyone will want to work for THC. Not everyone will get on with them. So we have to take in consideration the environment. But if a practice isn't happy with the role after they've had heavily input in them, I don't think we can it's not a revolving door. There has to come like 3 strikes, let's pause, and then revisit it.
Dr. Umar Ahmed from Plainsview Surgery has put in the chat, we usually employ Rs through our federation, but federation reluctant to employ GPRs due to pension and insurance implications. Little appetite for a lead practice to employ GPRs in the PCN. Any other solution you have come across?
No, they're either, you're either a lead practice or or each practice employs their own. So that's the other option. There isn't a lead practice. Every practice then employs their staff individually, which then creates, it solves one problem, but then you've got different, like different terms and conditions. But my question would be, we usually employ our Rs through the federation, but the Federation reluctant to employ GPs. I think that may change. That may change moving forward when the R's budget has, like it's merged in the new financial year. But I don't know of any other, I don't know how other areas have got round it, if I'm being honest. So sorry.
Okay. Umar, does that answer your question at all, or would you like to come in?
Yes, I think it does answer my question in that I don't think there is another third way.
No.
So yeah, it does answer. But I think because the Federation is a limited company, I think there's extra pension contributions or something, so it makes it a little bit difficult to employ GPs through your Federation.
Okay.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, solution. So Lorna J. Mackey's just put in the chat. Any practice can employ and detail your internal agreement in your network agreement. In terms of employing the GPR staff. So losing one example is what would be your advice in terms of a PCN working together, been together now since 2019, a practice then merges or leaves that PCN, and then obviously you've set out, from your funding as a PCN, what are we going to try and implement and employ staff going forward for that financial year, to then lose a practice within that financial year, the implications of that. What would be advice to PCNs and practices for which this will impact?
I mean, I was going to say,
don't give me daggers, Tara.
No, you don't have to. I've written a blog on this. You don't have to start again. But I suppose if a network leaves, if a practice leaves a network, there is a drop in income. So there will be a discussion around what happens with the staff. There'll be a consultation process. And there'll be, like a fight for the good staff, essentially, depending on where that practice kind of then goes on to. But I suppose for the PCN left with a deficit in their funding, or what a perceived deficit, they just need to have a look at it. But in the kind of splitting up, you need to make sure that your network is still viable. So you can't split up. How do I say this? Yeah, you can't kind of split up a network. You have to divide the finances and divide the roles. And you'll have to go through that consultation process. And then whatever the PCN is left with, then you need to review, okay, what do we want to do moving forward? And you'll need a new plan. You'll need to think about what roles do we employ moving forward. But the key is in that separation, you need to work out. It's not so much the money, it's the staff that cause the issue. Because, like if say you've got me and I'm 60% here and 40% there, you can't cut me in half. You can't cut me. So then that consultation process needs to happen, is what happens, or you make that role, you make me redundant because the business need has changed. And then you'll need to get HR advice, because you can't cut people 40%, or you give me 2 different contracts and I still do this and I still do that, or it's like a phased approach back, or one practice gives them the money, which is not going to happen. But that consultation process is really, really, really important.
It becomes really complicated, isn't it? It's all the staff complications and the impact of losing such funding can have, really. Debbie, you've got your hand up. Would you like to?
So hi Tara. How does sorry, my camera's not quite working because I've moved my office around. How does I'm going to turn that back off. The Federation and the PCN mix together? Is there any conflict of interest? And who kind of sits on all your meetings? Is it one GP and one practice manager from each practice? And so does the Federation ever tread on the PCN toes or practices toes? How does it all merge? Because I don't really know much about that side of things.
So I'd say yes. So you've got your conflicts of interest register. So if you're, and this is quite common actually, you will have, like your GPs, and a couple of your GPs will have, like they will do lots of things. So they might be the chair of the LMC. They might be, you know, like a federation director. They might do something. They might be involved, the medical director of a you know, like your community trust. So I suppose in that time, this is where the management of your conflicts of interest is really important. And that person may need to leave certain conversations. So if you're going to be having a conversation in your primary care network around enhanced access and what do you want to do moving forward, and at the moment you subcontract your federation to do that, they will have to leave that conversation. You can either have them, but you can ask them to say, as per our conflicts of interest policy, we want to discuss that within the network. And, you know, there is a conflict, so we'll need to leave that conversation. So I would say when that does happen, you need to be, you know, the chair of your PCN, your board or whatever, they need to be strong in saying, actually, that person now needs to leave this conversation, and that person won't be privy to some of the information taking place. And then the other part is around, typically in all of the PCNs we've supported, not all, but there will always be a clinical representative from each of the practices. And sometimes the PCN manager, the practice manager is part of the board, and sometimes they're not. It works well when they are, in my experience.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
One of your slides was talking about collaboration and immunisation of vaccinations that worked well. Did that achieve 100% take-up rate from those patients? Do you know?
Oh no.
No. Oh, I thought there was some words of wisdom out there to get them all in, and obviously those are the challenges.
It did boost it, but there will always be patients that don't want the vaccination. So I think, and you know, people are entitled to that, but it did increase uptake, but it wasn't 100%. But they achieved the target, but it wasn't 100% across the board, not through the will of the PCN, but more through the patients going, I hear what you're saying, and we're still not going to do it. But it did help, and I do think that's having a PCN wide service is a nice introduction to collaboration if you don't collaborate too much in your network. And I think it definitely is help because it's releasing the capacity in general practice. You can let your care coordinators, you know, like they can do the call and recall, and they can do the calls with the patient and provide that patient education. So I definitely think it's a good one if the networks don't have it.
Excellent, thank you very much. Dr. Callan has put in the chat, often it's declaration of interest, not conflict. Sometimes other interests may bring extra expertise to the discussion rather than hinder the conversations.
Absolutely. So in Maidenhead, a guy called Saj is the medical director of the PCN, but he's also the medical director in East Berkshire Community Healthcare, and we commission subcontract, and he doesn't leave the conversation. You know, like it works really well. But sometimes in other networks, you know, like it is helpful to just, you know, have that initial conversation. Say, do we want to bring that person in? So it's for you to manage. It's for the network to manage it and to acknowledge it. And it's okay. It's okay. You know, like sometimes they're talking about external providers. So I will then go, look, I'm going to leave this conversation because there is a conflict. They might not be talking about me. Yeah. But they might be talking about something else. And I think actually I do need to leave that. So I think it's just the professional management of a board.
In terms of PCN development and in terms of an agreement particular. So for partnerships in GP practices, we would always advise to make sure the partnership agreement is up to date. In terms of a PCN agreement, would you advise that these agreements are also up to date and kind of evolve in terms of the challenges and personalities that may be within, you know, the functions of that PCN, to make sure that all things are really covered and works freely?
Absolutely, and I would have that like yearly. So I don't know why I do this, but it does work quite well in that whether you're a limited company or not, to kind of have that, you know, like AGM. So have that, compile all of the things that the network has done, be really transparent with the finances, and share that with everybody, and then review the network agreement. And then so then you can move into the new financial year to say, we're like, are we still, after what we've done, are we happy of how we've operated? Do we want any difference? But I think having that consolidation of what the network has achieved, don't only review your network agreement when you're in conflict, because essentially you're like, I don't like that and I want to change it. But I think starting your new financial year as best as you can, like looking forward, so you're not constantly going, that happened last year. You need it's not a period of time, but like a bit of time, a meeting to go, this is what we achieved and this is what we want to do moving forwards. Do we want to change it? Do we want to change, like the voting structure and things like that? It's best to do it when you're not in conflict.
In terms of escalation of if there is conflict within a primary care network, what would be your advice from some of the experience that you've had to escalate? Obviously, LMCs are there to support PCNs as well as practices, but is there a next level for CDs to maybe consider?
I think if the LMC, well, it's really difficult because you don't want to be like, if the LMC can't do it, then we need to go, it's essentially it's mediation. So you can either go to your LMC or you can either get, like impartial mediation. The ICB is a bit busy at the moment, so they're not going to be able to help. So I would say my first port of call is, if you can't manage it internally, go to your LMC. If there is too much of a conflict of interest, depending on the setup of your LMC, then I would go through external mediation. But I would really think, where networks come unstuck is what do they want? Being really clear on what the outcome is going to be, and it can't just be, I want what I want. So
can NHS resolutions play a part in all of this? Because obviously this is a concept from NHS England who may not exist in the future.
It can, and I was just thinking, actually, we've got one of like a managed service. And in our contract, in the subcontract, it does say, like if we can't resolve it, then we'd have to go to NHS resolutions. But actually, we did resolve it in the end. So I would say, you've got your LMC, you've got NHS resolutions, and you've got an independent mediator. And the first person that springs to mind is a lady called Claire Sieber. But it will be the same, it's the same people. It's just another person doing, like carrying out the investigation and hearing what each party wants. So I think if, like your LMC can't resolve it, I don't know what different you're just adding to the process and probably adding to the expense.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Tara? Whilst you get your thinking cap on. So Tara, I put in the chat link to the PCN live event that you've got coming up in April, and I've also put in there as well a link to your podcast, because I've listened to them and I found them really really enjoyable. Actually, I'm not really a podcast person, but I'm starting to listen to more and more podcasts when I do the ironing. How sad is that? But that's me.
The only thing I'd say, I think the answers that I've given to your question, like it's really difficult, and there is a high level answer, but it's not that, like it's not simple in a primary care network, and you need more, you need more context. Totally. So I do apologize. It's hard to kind of, without kind of knowing, the history, like what is the conflict? Is it about finances? What is it about? It's hard to give really tailored advice, but I think the only thing I would say is, the longer I do this job, I can see the other person's point of view more. I can understand why they see and think and feel that the way they do. Whereas at the beginning, I was a bit like, the PCN is the best thing since sliced bread, and we should all work together and be one happy family. And now I'm like, I can understand. I can understand that, and we have to listen and communicate so much more than we think that we need to.
Interestingly, so from your experience, you would have seen different trends from different primary care networks. So if in the future, if these were ever devolved, and somebody came up with the idea of PCNs again, do you think people would take learning from what's just taken place in 2019 and over the last couple of years to go, we can't let some of this happen again, we need to do better? What sort of things, I'm putting you on the spot and you're probably thinking, oh no, here we go. But do you think, what sort of things would you advise that person having an idea in their head, let's create a network of practices working together?
This is, so I would say it does a little bit, and I used to be like, oh, can we just not get on with it? Like the vision and the purpose of the network. Like, why do we want to collaborate? And really think about the geographical boundary. So in some networks, the geography does not make sense. It really doesn't. So I would really look at the geography. And I think there is something around, like in some areas, like it was self-organized, but in some areas, it was kind of like they were told what to do. So I definitely think it'd be interesting to see if networks were given the choice to self-organize. Would that be slightly different around their geography and their patients? And I also think, this is like you're recording this.
You don't have to answer, Tara.
No, I will. I think if I was being really honest, I think practices, if given the choice, they would be able to identify what roles they really needed. Versus say, well, that you need this role, you need this role, you need this role, because it puts those staff in a very difficult situation. But practices collectively would be able to go, okay, we can support these sorts of roles really, really well, versus trying to shoehorn, I think, some of the other roles in. So I think a bit more selection over the roles. We've got it now, but it wasn't like that in the first place. And I think you're probably more control over the R's budget, around clinical supervision, things like that. So I think, probably a bit more autonomy over roles, a bit more autonomy how they organise themselves. I would start there, but I'd definitely look at the vision and the purpose of the network.
Yeah, Dr. Calibut has stole the word from my mouth, which was estates for our stuff, because it's one of the biggest, grumbles that we do here from practices, and it impacts massively. And even for those R stuff, you feeling that, you're working in one place and that you want a sense of belonging, really. No, thank you very much. That's really useful. Are there any questions for Tara at all before I let her escape? No. Well, thank you, Tara, for coming along today. I think it's been a massive coup for us in Nottinghamshire to get you along. Honestly, you sit there thinking, no. But honestly, when you came back and said that you were coming along today, we were really pleased and jumping around with excitement. So thank you very much for your time today and your presentation. And all the best in the next few events that you're doing, and hopefully we'll see you in the future.
Well, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you, Tara. Bye-bye. Okay, I'll stop recording and we will end the session there.